It's got to. Yeah. Right, see you there.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Glickman, the director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School, and welcome to the forum. I don't ordinarily do this, but my predecessor is here, Al Simpson. Where is Al Simpson? All right. Just want to... My hairline's going to look like his after I'm done with this place. Tonight we are honored to be joined by two of our country's most important and distinguished voices on Iraq. That's Bill Kristol and John Deutsch, who will engage in a debate titled, "Should We Attack Iraq Now?" As you know, we spend much of our time here in the forum discussing and debating some of the most difficult issues of the day. It could be abortion, the death penalty, affirmative action, the World Trade Organization, Cuba, the Middle East conflict. In fact, Professor Deutsch was on this stage last year debating Iraq, and Bill Kristol was here debating the outcome of the Florida recount. We continue that tradition of debating difficult issues with tonight's discussion. When I served as a member of Congress and voted in favor of the Gulf War resolution over 10 years ago, I witnessed firsthand how divisive issues of war and peace can be. I know from talking with many of the students here, whether you are American or international students, you have strong passions on this issue. But one of the most important lessons I learned in my 20-plus years in government is that civil discussion is the essence of democracy. As a country, as a community, we cannot move forward without it. I ask you to remember that lesson as we discuss this challenging issue tonight. But I don't want anyone here to confuse civility with apathy or indifference. Much as it is at stake, the decisions by our government could involve the lives of a lot of people in this room. One of Bobby Kennedy's favorite quotes was from Dante. The The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a time of great moral crises, maintain their neutrality. I hope that none of us will end up in Dante's Inferno, but this issue is too important to be viewed from the sidelines. Moderating tonight's very timely debate and introducing our two participants is the Kennedy School's own resident expert, Professor Graham Allison. Well, you can clap now or you can wait till I finish. Graham is the director of the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is one of the nation's leading analysts on U.S. national security, defense policy, and terrorism. Having served in the Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense, he was awarded the Defense Department's highest civilian award, the Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Graham Allison.
Thank you very much, Dan. Let me welcome you as well tonight for a timely debate to present and assess the arguments for and against the military attack on Iraq. We have, as Dan has said, two of America's leading public intellectuals, each of whom has thought deeply about this issue, each of whose views actually count in the decision-making process in Washington today about these issues, and each of whom has come to a conclusion that differs significantly from the others. If I can add one more similarity, the Kennedy School is very proud to note that each of these gentlemen have long-standing relationships here. Bill Kristol, having taught public policy as an assistant professor here at the Kennedy School in the 1980s, and John Deutsch as a current member of the internal board of BCSIA and a member of the visiting committee of the school. Indeed, as Dean Nye mentioned earlier tonight upstairs, because we have a number of the members of the visiting committee here, we have a current member of the visiting committee, John Deutsch, and a former member of the visiting committee, Bill Kristol. So in some sense, this is all inside the family. My job tonight is to frame the issue before the House and to keep time. In one line, the issue is, on the current trajectory, after the UN Security Council votes for intrusive UN inspections, the UN inspectors return to Iraq and they're stiffed by Saddam. Should the U.S. at that point lead a military attack on Iraq? There are two answers to this question: yes and no. And not only our speakers tonight, but each of you in the audience have a chance to answer for yourself. Let me take just another minute to set this issue in context. For tonight's audience, many students here at the Kennedy School and elsewhere in the college and the university have over the last week or two been thinking what you would have done if you had been a member of Congress recently and had had to vote on the resolution to authorize the president to use force to disarm Saddam. As you may have noted, though some in Massachusetts I'm sure haven't, the president won this authority in the Senate by a vote of 77 to 23. Here in Massachusetts, our senators split. Senator Kerry voting for, Senator Kennedy voting against. Other international students here at the school have lately been arguing about whether, if they should return to their country and have the good fortune sometime to be representative to the United Nations, or foreign minister, or indeed prime minister, how would they make a judgment about the current debate in the UN on a Security Council resolution authorizing intrusive inspections backed by the use of force if that's what's required? And you could ask yourself, those of you from countries other than the U.S., where you would come down on that issue. Painful as it is, and attractive as it is to fight the question in order to try to find some way to weasel out of having to answer, at the end of the process, when you've done the best analysis you can, and with all the uncertainties that remain, those who bear responsibility in government have to decide. So tonight, the issue for our two colleagues and for you and all of us as members of the audience is as follows, and state it one more time. Assume history marches on the current path, including last week's positive vote in Congress to authorize the use of force if necessary, including a UN Security Council vote in the next week or two authorizing intrusive inspections, including the arrival of the inspectors who were then stiffed by Saddam, or judged to have been stiffed in their view in terms of unfettered, unlimited inspections. Question: at that point, 6 or 8 weeks from now, likely before Christmas, should the U.S. lead a military attack on Iraq? President Bush continues to insist that he has not yet made up his mind on the use of military force. What he has clearly decided is to threaten military action against Iraq and to set the stage for a devastating U.S.-led military attack to destroy Saddam's regime. It's possible, I think not likely, but possible, that these conditions will create incentives for actors within Iraq to eliminate Saddam in a coup. Or indeed, as Secretary Rumsfeld mentioned this past weekend on the Tube, maybe Saddam and his family will flee to take sanctuary somewhere else, and President Bush could have a victory without war. But for the purposes of the debate tonight, finally one more time, on this trajectory, absent any miracles, when the crossroads come, if President Bush were to ask you, or our two debaters, whether or not to pull the trigger on a military attack on Iraq, what would your answer be? Arguing the affirmative tonight, we're very pleased to welcome back to the forum Bill Kristol, founder and editor of the Weekly Standard, which has emerged over the last 6 or 7 years to become one of the most influential journals of opinion in American policy circles. Bill was earlier, as I mentioned, an assistant professor here at the school, from which he went to run a project for the Republican future that helped shape the strategy that produced the victory for the Republicans in 1994. He served as chief of staff to Vice President Quayle, and he's been an active participant in the Washington debate about what is sometimes called the project, of which Iraq may be only the first step. Arguing against this proposition is our colleague from MIT, John Deutsch. John is an institute professor at MIT, having served earlier as a professor of chemistry and as provost of the university. In the Clinton administration, he served as Director of Central Intelligence, as Deputy Secretary of Defense, where he was my boss and Joe Nye's for a while, and as Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Technology. And earlier in the Carter administration, he was Undersecretary of Energy. So we're going to give these two gentlemen each 10 minutes to state their case. First, for the affirmative, Bill Kristol, and then John Deutsch. Then we're going to go to open discussion with the audience very quickly. So if you have a question or a point that you can put succinctly, you can be thinking about it. But let's first begin with Bill Kristol and say how happy we are to have him here tonight.
Thank you, Graham. It is good to be here. Graham has given a somewhat more complicated question, I suppose, than the actual question I think on the flyers or that I got in the mail, which was, should we attack Iraq now? Which had a certain nice simplicity, I thought, and would allow, if I were answering that question, I could have appeared very moderate by saying, no, we should wait 2 or 3 months. I also would say that I would, though it is an attack, obviously, I would reframe it as, should we liberate Iraq in 2 or 3 months? And then I would be happy to say that the answer is yes. Let me be brief because these arguments are pretty familiar by this point, obviously, and I think have been made actually quite ably by members of the administration and, in fact, by Democrats on the Hill who've joined the Bush administration in authorizing the use of force against Saddam Hussein. So I'll be brief. Let me frame it by quoting a Clinton administration official, one of the really distinguished officials of that administration, from some testimony he gave almost exactly 6 years ago, just to show that this isn't a partisan matter and that, in fact, Republicans and Democrats of goodwill should agree, basically, with obviously some tactical differences and differences in exactly how to do it, which is always the case, but basically should agree on the outlines of this policy. There will be no stability in the region or improved circumstances for the Iraqi people until Saddam Hussein and his regime is replaced. That's a senior Clinton administration official testifying to Congress 6 years ago. That is true, I believe. Regime change is a desirable goal in the case of Iraq. The history of Saddam's tyranny is, I think, been documented well enough in many places. Magazines, not just the Weekly Standard, but the New Yorker, Jeffrey Goldberg's terrific reporting, the recent piece by Bob Kaplan in the New Republic, that there's not much quarrel, I think, about the desirability of regime change. But obviously, that doesn't prove the necessity and urgency of regime change. The necessity and urgency of regime change in Iraq comes from his pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. And therefore, the question is, are there ways to deal with the issue of weapons of mass destruction absent regime change, absent removing Saddam? Does he have weapons of mass destruction? I think the answer is yes. He had them in '96. The senior administration official said, testifying to Congress, "We believe that he retains an undetermined quantity of chemical and biological agents." This was while the UNSCOM inspections were going on, very intrusive inspections, and while they had been somewhat successful, incidentally, in destroying quite a lot of stuff. They had destroyed, when they knew what they had destroyed, they thought they had destroyed a much higher percentage of what Saddam had than it turned out he had, and especially were appalled to discover how little they knew about his biological and nuclear programs. But in any case, he had chemical and biological agents still, despite 4.5 years at that point of inspections. And in the case of nuclear capacity, we believe, the U.S. government believed in '96 that Iraq maintained both the motivation and the expertise to revitalize the nuclear program. Should it be able to do so right now, the administration official said, they are prevented from doing so because of the presence of the UNSCOM regime and other efforts to monitor the sanctions on Iraq. UNSCOM was expelled, it was prevented from doing its job, and left, first prevented from doing its job in late '97. There were various negotiations. President Clinton in February '98 basically threatened war with Saddam, and Congress supported him in that. Kofi Annan brokered a deal, which some of us thought was not a good deal, but the president accepted. The inspectors stayed in for the remainder of 1998. They finally left in December. The president bombed for 4 days, as you recall, in December. Not the president, the U.S. bombed Iraq for 4 days in December. Since then, there have been no inspections, and that's now almost 4 years. It is a totally safe bet that since he has always wanted the nuclear capacity, that he has revitalized that effort without the inspections, and certainly on the chemical and biological front that he's moved full speed ahead. Could inspections reinserted into Iraq convince us that he doesn't have chemical weapons of mass destruction capacity, or could they even stop or impede him in any significant way from moving ahead in developing those capacities? Most people who've been weapons inspectors, Richard Spurzel, who did the bio program, the biological weapons program for UNSCOM, Richard Butler, who ran the whole thing, say no. I mean, inspections can work with a more or less cooperative government to verify something that they are doing, and maybe some parts of the bureaucracy don't quite want to do it, so it's useful to have inspectors in to make sure it's happening. No one has ever really thought inspections could work in the context of a hostile government trying to hide and deceive and mislead. The inspections originally, you recall, were in for the sake of ensuring that Saddam lived up to his promise of disarmament. It wasn't supposed to be a cat and mouse game. It was supposed to be he's going to disarm, and these inspections will just reassure us that he really is. We're far, far from that. He's had 4 years to hide everything. The place is the size of, what, Texas, I think. You're not going to have 200 or 400 or 600 inspectors go around with any confidence at all that you could find any significant percentage of what's being done, or even really, I think, impede him from doing what he's doing. So I think inspections is a false middle ground. And I think the truth is you either need to be for regime change, which will mean military action, unless we get very lucky, and the threat of military action might provoke others to take things in their own hands. But it means being willing to, you can't make the threat unless you're willing to do it, so it means being willing to do military action. Or you say deterrence. It's fine. I mean, basically, we can try to slow him down a little, but he's going to get weapons of mass, he has weapons of mass destruction, he's going to get nuclear weapons, we can live with it. We lived with the Soviet Union for all those decades, we can live with Saddam. That is the serious argument, I think, against war. It's been articulated. Brett Statecraft probably had the clearest articulation of it in the Journal about 2 months ago. I don't myself agree with it. It seems to me to ignore the possibility of using terrorist cutouts, which makes deterrence requires that you know where the weapon is coming from, so you can punish the person who delivered it, as we've seen with anthrax a year ago, as one can easily imagine with all kinds of the use of chemical and biological weapons. You may not know next time where the weapons are coming from, or you may not be able to prove connections with terrorist groups. Be hard to retaliate, therefore hard to deter. Saddam is also not the kind of dictator you want to be deterring. I mean, some dictators are deterrable because they're rational, cautious, predictable. The post-Stalin Soviet dictators were more or less of this nature. Saddam has been a risk taker. He is, obviously invaded Kuwait. He didn't he didn't pull out, even though we were masked to invade him. He tried to assassinate an American president in 1993 when that, one would have thought just that doing that only 2 years after we went to war with him might be something he wouldn't want to do. He's fanatically continued the effort to get the weapons of mass destruction, despite the risk of bringing upon himself what he's now about to bring upon himself. Even if you think he's not as much of a risk taker as I think, the idea of Saddam with these weapons, I think, is a pretty horrifying thought for the regional balance in the Middle East, for what his power over his neighbors, for the incentives it creates for his neighbors. What does the Middle East look like 5 or 10 years from now if Saddam has thwarted the international community and been succeeded in developing weapons of mass destruction? What does the world look like, incidentally? The lesson of Saddam, and I would add the lesson of North Korea, is you can sign anything, you can sweet talk people, you can sucker Western governments into even helping you in the case of North Korea. You develop your weapons, and then the Western governments look and say, ooh, well, we can't deal with that country. They have nuclear weapons. The Taliban we can take care of. They're not a real problem, but we're going to be deterred if they have nuclear weapons. The lesson, every dictator in the world will take that lesson, which is the way to stay safe and in power is to get any weapon of mass destruction you can. The more the better. Nuclear, best of all. And as soon as the dictators of the world take that lesson, about 2 months later, the democracies of the world will decide, do we really want to depend on the U.S. in that circumstance? I mean, what does Japan do? What does Taiwan do? I mean, let's leave aside the Middle East, let alone the instability in the Middle East, which is already a scary thought. What does the world look like 10 years from now if Saddam Hussein has succeeded in his project of getting weapons of mass destruction? I think it's an unacceptably scary, unstable, and really dangerous and brutal and deadly world. And also, just final point on the deterrence issue, which again I think is the core issue really on the other side. What is the morality of deterrence? I mean, serious people had serious moral problems with deterrence, even in the case of the Soviet Union. It wasn't something we wanted. Hey, great, let's have a balance of terror with the Soviet Union where we can kill tens of millions, hundreds of millions of each other's citizens. It was something we got into. Would have been better if we had never gotten into such a situation. Do we want to be in a balance of terror with Saddam Hussein? Are we comfortable with the prospect of a Cuban Missile Crisis, to use something that Graham knows a huge amount about, and whose anniversary is, I guess 40-year anniversary is this week, I think, with Saddam Hussein across the table? Are we confident that everyone will behave calmly, rationally, and will back away from the brink? Say nothing of other regional actors in Cuban Missile Crisis type situations with Saddam Hussein. I think deterrence is not only not an attractive alternative, but not really an acceptable alternative, and that's why I think we need to go ahead and remove Saddam. Is Saddam as much of a threat as I've said? One last quote from the senior administration official. He is a significant terrorist threat. He tried to assassinate President Bush. He continues to carry out terrorist activities in Jordan and elsewhere. He has sponsored terrorist attacks on UN and relief personnel. Here's a person who uses terrorism as an instrument of statecraft. That's important because one of the, and I'll be very brief now, one of the arguments, the more recent arguments against removing Saddam has been it will impede the war on terror. My view, and Ruel Garecht argues this in the Weekly Standard this week, is that it will help the war on terror. European cooperation will not be impeded by our going against Iraq. That's a matter of mutual self-interest and mutual belief in the war on terror. And in the Muslim world and the Islamic world, in my view, we will get more cooperation if people think we are serious about doing what we say we're going to do, and about preventing dictators from developing weapons of mass destruction and preventing people from harboring terrorists, rather than looking as if we're ineffectual and blustering. The way to get cooperation is to be respected and liked, if possible, but also feared, and removing Saddam would be an appropriate way, since it's a just way of being feared. I want to address the issue of preemption, which we can talk about, and I imagine will, but I'll say one last thing, which is I do think not only, I think we're doing this because we have to do it. I would also say that it raises hopeful opportunities for the future of the Middle East. Obviously, wars are not something to be welcomed, and nor are the risks of death and destruction to Americans, to Iraqis, to neighboring countries, to Americans over there and over here, incidentally. Those risks should not be minimized. So I'm not one of those who thinks, who thinks it's whatever is likely to happen, it might go quite easily. It's imprudent to plan on that, and it's improper, I think, to count on that. Obviously, one has to prepare for bad cases and even for worse cases. Having said that, if the war goes well, and I think the odds are that it will, and we will win, I think the removal of Saddam opens up a much more hopeful prospect, and not just for the people of Iraq, which it certainly does, but for the whole Middle East.
Thank you very much, Bill. Professor Deutsch.
Some of you may wonder who that senior official was in 1996. I would like to say the only testimony I gave was classified. And the students in the audience here at Harvard know you shouldn't believe a director of Central Intelligence anyway. But we had Ken Edelman come up here and debate this Iraq issue. We could have had Richard Pearl, but we clearly have the first team with you here this evening, Bill Crystal. There's a justification for removing Saddam Hussein. It's been ably stated here. He has weapons of mass destruction, and he's shown a willingness to use them. That is an absolutely solid basis for making this country and other countries in the world prepared to have a regime change in Iraq. There are subsidiary issues which are used to justify his removal. He contributes to instability in the region, true. He's been a disaster for the Iraqi people, absolutely true. He is a supporter of terrorism. Those are subsidiary reasons, they're important reasons, but the principal reasons is he has obtained weapons of mass destruction and shown a willingness to use them, chemical and biological agents. So the evident conclusion is that we should go in and remove him militarily right now, or very soon. That's the evident conclusion. Answer, no, that's not right. There are two other questions that the United States should ask itself and have good answers for before they invade Iraq. The first question is, will the region be more stable after this action than it is today? And the second is, will U.S. interests in the region and U.S.'s position in the region, I now speak of the Middle East broadly, be strengthened as a result of our leadership and our entry into Iraq? I suggest to you that the answer to both those points is no. We do not have adequate reason to believe that either will be the case for several reasons. And I want to point very briefly to three reasons. We do not have a hint of what government will succeed Saddam Hussein. Now, I completely share the view that governments of countries should not be formed by people in Washington, by directors of Central Intelligence, or worse yet, deans of the Kennedy School. But it is very important that you have some glimmer of what the character is of a provisional government, which hopefully will begin moving Iraq on a step-by-step basis towards democracy, some sense of the composition of that provisional government. We have no such sense today, and I put the blame on this all the way back to the first Clinton administration, when the steps were not taken to publicly, visibly go forward with a group of people to form a provisional government in Iraq. Is this important? The answer is yes, because the second outstanding question are, what do the nations in the region think about this action? The nations in the region have a vital interest in Iraq. Iraq was plunked down there in 1921 or 27, whenever it was, by the British, seemingly a completely artificial state, but in fact a very, very important state to maintain a delicate balance of stability in a very complicated part of the world. Today, the leadership in the countries in Turkey, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and yes, even in Iran and Syria, which have very important Kurdish minorities, do not have a sense of what will happen in Iraq after Saddam. And until that political consensus is built, not perfectly, not with certainty in the region, until that is there, you are going to have those countries in the region reluctant to support us, unsure of which way it will go, not helping us as we so successfully did in 1991, form a coalition in the region which allowed us to achieve a very difficult purpose in the Middle East, the liberation of Kuwait, with the people in the region whose lives and whose communities are at stake, joined with us. Now, I don't think it's going to be possible to have all these countries stand together and agree on something, but it is possible, if you have a provisional government and if you work at it, on having a coalition and consensus in the region which supports the United States intervention much more strongly than it does today. So we speak about a military campaign. I've had responsibility working in the Department of Defense, starting way back in 1961, off and on, worrying about military actions. There are other people here who've had equal experience, if not more. But I want to draw to you three different scenarios of what might happen in military action in Iraq, because I think it represents, it's not a prediction, it represents the kind of events you might expect there. The first is that when we land our troops and put our motorized men and women there on the ground in Iraq, that Saddam takes the Republican Guard and sends his soldiers and his tanks out to meet us. If that happens, in about 48 hours they will be annihilated. There will be very few, if any, U.S. casualties, and we will be victors in a period of days, if not even shorter. I don't think he'll do that. He had a glimmer of what would happen to his military, and especially his armor, since he has no eyes, no air force, if he, in fact, deploys his military. So what's the second option? He takes all of his equipment, his men, his 6 or 7 Republican Guard divisions in a few of the major cities, and he digs them in. And he waits for the United States to come to him. Now, how are we going to do that? Are we going to do street-by-street fighting like Stalingrad? No. What we're going to do is we could take a line a mile wide, and we're going to make absolutely flat rubble out of it and bring our mechanized forces in behind it to get to the center of Baghdad. We will absolutely blast the place apart in order to conquer him in the heart of Baghdad, bring our military forces there to victory without exposing U.S. men and women to risk of dying. And that would be a strategy that I would support, and one that I would support, a tactic that I would support with the use of overwhelming force. If we have to go to the center of Baghdad and the center of some of these other Iraqi cities, it is going to be absolutely unbelievable. And the people who are going to suffer are the Iraqi people, and we will be victorious, but it won't take days. It will take weeks or months, and we will be left with a tremendous mess on our hands. What's the third alternative? The third alternative is that we can go and occupy 2 chunks of Iraq, 100 square miles each, one south of Basra, one north in the north, and sit there for a while and let Saddam come to us, or show by our presence there that eventually we are going to see a change in regime. It's a much more patient strategy, much more conservative strategy, one which will lead to less violence, less destruction, and one which I must say is not present in the rhetoric of the current administration. But in all these scenarios, what I want to stress by going through them is that it is important to know that this is war. You can't predict the outcome of war so well, and it is not good to say the odds are likely to be in our favor. You have to know more than that if you're going to go to war. And then there is the additional problem that he has biological and chemical agents, and he may choose to use them. I couldn't agree more with Bill Kristol about deterrence. But what, in fact, do we plan to do if he uses biological and chemical agents, either against U.S. military units or perhaps against Israel? What will we do then? Have we thought that out, and do we have a response for that? So these three questions: the absence of a provisional government around which democracy can grow, which needs to be built in a public way over some period of time. It includes allowance for political growth, economic support, social services, ways of helping Iraq join the family of nations after there's been a change in government, an understanding among the countries in the region whose real security is involved here. I'm not talking about France, the UK, Denmark. I'm talking about Jordan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and to a degree the interests of Iran and Syria. And unless we know that that region will remain stable, we can put in some James Madison, who received an honorary degree from Harvard, some James Madison who we find behind a sand dune somewhere, as Senator Biden says. But the fact of the matter is that's most unlikely. That we'll end up having a very unstable region. So what do I think should be done? I do not think that we should avoid a U.S. policy which says our policy is to have a change in regime in Iraq. I believe that's the right objective, and in that I certainly share Bill Kristol's view. But I don't think we're ready to do it in a way that maximizes the chance of achieving greater stability in the region, greater security for the United States, and greater protection of our interests. We need to do better at building a coalition. We need to do better about getting the countries in these regions to speak up so that the Arab youth in the capitals throughout the region will see that there are some Arab opinion, some considerable Arab opinion, who think that this is a necessary action. And we need to have a much clearer view of what the character and extent and length of time of our military involvement is going to be. So the objective is right, the timing is wrong, and I don't think the case has been made to thoughtful people with experience in these matters. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the two of you for sticking to your time and putting your points so succinctly. Let me put one question, then I'm going to ask my friend Namir to put a question, then we're going to take questions from the mics so you can get in line, and there are mics on the ground floor and the upper floor. I would like to put a question that both of you touched on, but neither of you quite went to, and to see what your short version of an answer is. The National Intelligence Estimate, which was classified last week, which is the best assessment of the intelligence community on Iraq, and which had remained classified until just last week, addresses the question of what Saddam is likely to do in the case that we attack him for the purpose of toppling the regime. And it says, let me quote here briefly, "Should Saddam conclude that a U.S.-led attack could no longer be deterred, he probably would become much less constrained in adopting terrorist actions. Such terrorism might involve conventional means, as with Iraq's unsuccessful attempt at a terrorist offensive in '91, or could involve weapons of mass destruction." So Senator Levin then pressed him on this to say, let me understand, if we leave Saddam alone, what do you think is going to happen? And the intelligence analyst says, in the foreseeable future, given the conditions we now understand, the likelihood of a WMD attack on us is low. So then Senator Levin persists, and he says, now, in the case that we attack him, if we initiate an attack, and he thought he was an extremist or otherwise, what is the likelihood in response to our attack that he would use chemical or biological weapons? Senior intelligence witness, pretty high in my view. So I'd be very interested for each of you briefly to say how you assess the risk that if and as we attack him, whether before December or after John's questions are answered, he attacks us with chemical or biological weapons there in the region or, God forbid, here at home, and how one proposes to factor that into the analysis of this issue.
No, it's the greatest risk, obviously, and people in the government are thinking seriously about it. I think it argues for speed and urgency and deception, and it argues precisely, if I might say, against, in my view, John Deutsch's long build-up where we announce regime changes and objectives, so Saddam knows he's targeted, and then we spend months and years rallying everyone in the region and laying the groundwork carefully. I mean, precisely if you think there is a reasonable chance that he will try to use weapons of mass destruction when he knows he's targeted, you want to go in as fast as you can and decapitate the regime. You want to use deception. You want to clearly say, as we have already begun to say, to any commander of Saddam's that if he refuses in order to use such weapons, he'll be taken care of. He won't be killed, or perhaps won't even suffer a war crimes trial, even though he might deserve one. And conversely, anyone who uses such weapons will be the object of a war crimes trial if he survives to make it to that. But I mean, it's a very serious war planning matter. The flip side of it, of course, is if you say, well, gee, we can't do it because he might use these weapons of mass destruction, you are basically saying we are now deterred from military action against any dictator anywhere who has weapons of mass destruction and is enough of a bloodthirsty tyrant to threaten to use them. And I think that's unacceptable. That such a world is unacceptable, not just from the point of view of U.S. interests, but from the point of view of overall peace and stability.
I'll tell you a secret about national intelligence estimates. Other than the fact, just to show you how uncertain they are, Joe Nye used to run them. The answer is we don't know whether he'll use chemical or biological weapons. It's the first thing to remember, you don't know. The more important question is, if you make a hypothetical he does, what were you planning to do about it? Now, you say serious thought has been given to that. I hope so. But I do want to say that I think that possession of a weapons of mass destruction by a very evil person cannot inoculate that person from any military action by the United States. And therefore, we're going to have to learn how to take these risks extremely carefully, whether it's in Baghdad or in North Korea. And it argues much more strongly for being careful and doing it right and taking the time to know that you've done everything you possibly can to minimize the risks.
We have at least one person who actually is from Iraq, though he left about 20 years ago here, who's a member of the visiting committee. So I asked Namir if he would put the first question, please. Namir Kadar.
Well, thank you, Grant. My question would be, beyond Saddam, I know you worked on a project, Iraq after Saddam, and the potential of the country, and the ingredients that country has to become one of the first Arab countries that is capable of establishing a democratic system in Iraq and becoming a model. Are we taking that into consideration in looking beyond that? And what would the prize be in Iraq becoming a positive participant in the Middle East, in the peace process in the Middle East, as well as converting the Middle East into an economic welfare instead of being a destructive power?
I'm only moderating here, but I will make a brief comment and then turn it back to the two. I did participate as a co-chair of a study called Iraq 2010, which is what Mr. Kadar has referred to. and not as an Iraqi expert at all, but looking at the question, should there be a regime change, and we didn't say how that might occur, could you imagine a positive future for Iraq and the region? And we gathered 20 of the best experts on Iraq for this study. And myself, I'll say, I was quite impressed with the extraordinary possibilities of a positive nature in Iraq as compared to what's normally thought of as a fairly negative story. There are lots of complexities, particularly given the ethnic and tribal composition of Iraq, and given the brutal history of the Ba'athist regime, and especially of Saddam. But prior to that, Iraq was the middle-class successful society of the region, and in terms of the resources, both human and natural, oil, water, potential for tourism and others, Iraq that turned out to be a positive, evolving, tolerant society that was prosperous, which wouldn't be in a year, but by 2010 you could imagine happening, would end up being a stabilizer that would have could have potentially quite positive effects. And I believe, actually, if I read the Weekly Standard or others on this topic, that's part of what some people call the project. That is, if you had one case of success in the region, maybe that would have impacts or infect or at least be an example for the others. But maybe I'll see what the gentleman thinks.
Well, no, it's just a word. I mean, I'm actually also optimistic about the future of a post-Saddam Iraq. It's not going to be easy. The administration in this one is a little bit in a catch-22. If they work with the Iraqi National Congress or with particular individuals or call meetings, they're accused of sort of trying to impose a government ahead of time from Washington. If they don't call meetings with Iraqi exiles and dissidents, and of course you can't really meet with the Iraqis inside, then they're accused of not preparing for a post-Saddam Iraq. So it's, as I think John would agree, it's a difficult task to manage just as a sort of governmental matter from the State Department and CIA and Defense. And I actually think they are pretty serious about getting a provisional government in quite quickly. They do regard this as a war of liberation. Now, I think it will also be a war of occupation, and I would argue on this question of what happens afterwards. The administration, after a little bit of initial, more than a little, after too much reluctance, in my view, to say honestly that of course we're going to have to stay there, and of course substantial American troops are going to have to stay there, if only to find all the weapons of mass destruction, which, believe me, we're not going to trust a provisional Iraqi government, or I don't even think, frankly, multinational forces to do. Just to get the weapons of mass destruction out of the place means a lot of U.S. troops for a year or two. And I think in Afghanistan, I'm critical of the Bush administration for underinvesting in post-Taliban Afghanistan. Probably could have used more military there, probably still could, certainly could use more civil efforts. But the administration is not going to make this mistake on Iraq, because they do know how central Iraq is to the future of the Middle East. So I think you will have a big American force which can help make sure the country stays united, which can help foster the movement to democracy. It won't be Japan quite, or Germany, but it will be more than Afghanistan and less than Japan, I think, will be the model. But look, you can't say ahead of time. No one can exactly how it's going to work. No one, I don't believe people before we went into Afghanistan said, Mr. Karzai, he's the man, he emerged. And I think in a way, as I say, the administration is caught a little bit in a catch-22. If they say it's Mr. Chalabi, then people say, well, why Chalabi, why not someone else? And if they say, well, we're not sure what it's going to be, people say, hey, you haven't done enough planning for a post-Saddam Iraq.
I think the potential of Iraq in a democratic society is unbelievably bright. Same is true for Iran, same is true of Libya. It's another one of those reasons why we have to maintain the U.S. position in the region carefully for the long haul, because we have interests in all these places to help move them towards democracy. You know, the deployment we're looking at here is probably, it's north of 250,000 U.S. servicemen and servicewomen. So you talk about them being there for 2 or 3 years, you're talking about a very, very long period of time for a lot of things to go wrong, and huge, huge expense and things that need to be managed. He does know he's a target, you know. He knows he's been a target for a long time. What we failed to do, and this is a failure of both administrations, is to take the public steps of defining what the government would be like, how does it fit into the region, how will the society make a transition after Saddam Hussein, so that there is something for some brave general to hang his or her hat on, and in Iraq it's his hat, to try and knock the guy over.
So please, let me get you to introduce yourself and then put a question briefly.
I'm from Paul Schult, Britain, one of those countries that doesn't matter very much, apparently.
It may be the only country that's fighting with the U.S. in this effort.
Right.
So please, sir.
There's a feature of the situation which doesn't much appear in the US debate, and it hasn't come up tonight. It is that it's not just that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and wants more, but it has unique legal obligations which were deliberately and repeatedly imposed by the UN, that it should not have them. It was a condition of ending the second aggressive war, which that country started, a war which was overhung by the possible use of WMD and which profoundly affected the course of that war, that to end it, Iraq would give up those weapons, would have to cooperate, and a historically unique and strong system of inspection obligations, declaration obligations was imposed. Iraq has unquestionably defied those for 11 years. Nothing else now will work except the threat of military force. It's not conceivable that nobody has argued that sanctions will work. So my question would be, why could you think that any other arms control or disarmament treaty anywhere will hold if this one is seen just to be fudged, walked away from, and ignored? What compliance issue will in future be successfully resolved? And how is the proliferation of weapons technologies going to be managed for the rest of the century? And why, more generally, are these discussions framed with a concept of American national interest which ignores your own interest in managing these things and in trying to set up a rule-bound legal system which will function in the world?
We've got it.
You seem to be ignoring it. And why is that?
Good.
What's the point of muscle if you don't use a bit of enforcement?
Good and difficult question. 2 minutes each, please.
Well, I agree with the first 90% of the question, and think it's actually a very helpful statement of the facts about what Iraq agreed to and their just blatant violation of it. Look, rule-bound systems work for most countries because most countries are either decent democratic regimes or stable non-democratic regimes that see a common interest in abiding by these rule-bound systems and don't want to run the risk of violating them. There are a few countries that seem just absolutely determined to violate them, and I think I agree with the long-term future. If one believes precisely in greater role for international rules, one has to be willing to enforce those rules when they're violated. That's the point the President made at the UN. It's the point Tony Blair has made repeatedly. And I think it is correct. And that is why everyone made fun of the axis of evil. But, you know, it wasn't silly. I mean, now we've seen in the news in North Korea. I mean, there are actually rather few countries in the world whose regimes are of a character. They're so dictatorial. They're so reckless. They're so aggressive that they really do threaten that they seem uninterested and unwilling to abide by these rules in ways that many other countries, including ones that have rather disagreeable and distasteful regimes, still abide by. And, you know, two of the three, in fact, North Korea and Iraq are huge problems. It doesn't mean that every time a country violates these rule-based regimes, you can go in and use military force, or that you have to. And obviously, you should try to use diplomacy and pressure, and we'll do that in North Korea, or in the case of Iran, you should try to actually change the regime through much more political means. But I do think now in Iraq, we're up against it, and the only thing that will work is military force or the threat of military force.
Good. We're up here in the first balcony.
Thank you. My name is Robert Chu. I'm a fellow here at the Kennedy School. I have a question for Mr. Crystal, although I invite Dr. Deutsch to respond as well. Mr. Crystal, you alluded earlier to the Preemption Doctrine, which was articulated, at least publicly, for the first time by the National Security Council in its policy paper last month. Apart from the particular difficulties and questions raised by Dr. Deutsch with respect to the Iraq intervention, this is also a precedent for a new policy which allows the United States to intervene militarily when it feels that it is threatened, and I believe, at least in its statements, in a clear and present manner. I guess my question for you, Mr. Crystal, is I don't understand, again, the timing of this. Why now? Because there's been no, in my opinion, demonstrated imminence of an attack on this country to justify the use of preemptive force. And secondly, given that I believe it's the nature of the regime that we're talking about which distinguishes when preemption is justified, it essentially distinguishes our right to possess weapons of mass destruction as opposed to Iraq's or North Korea's. Should that not also require a judgment of the international community that indeed this is not simply a unilateral action which could lead to future chaos with individual countries deciding for themselves when preemption is warranted? And so I'd like you to answer that question as well, please.
Well, just on the second question, I mean, the international community deserves to be heard, but obviously the international community itself consists of a very mixed bag of regimes, and no, I wouldn't defer in that respect to Syria and China and other Security Council members about whether preemptive action were necessary against Iraq. That would be helpful. I mean, it's a general matter. You want as many allies as possible, and I hope we get UN Security Council approval. The Preemption Doctrine has been much, written about and debated. It's interesting to all of us, foreign policy types, because it's a doctrine and we like doctrines. It's a little bit overdone. I mean, there's always been the possibility of preemption against clear and present or imminent dangers, and obviously then the question becomes a question of judgment about urgency and imminence. The Cuban blockade, a blockade is an act of war. The blockade of Cuba was an act of preemption. No one had done anything to us. And indeed, there was not even a violation, I don't believe, of a whole string of UN resolutions. There wasn't a history of Cuban aggression against its neighbors particularly, et cetera. So this is perfectly consistent with traditional deterrence and containment doctrine. What changed, and the reason I take it the President and Condoleezza Rice thought they wanted to articulate the possibility of preemption in the national security, in the West Point speech and then the national security strategy document, is what changed is 9/11. And I think an honest statement by them may be frankly imprudent. I mean, if I were in there, I'm not sure I would have bothered getting into this. You don't need the preemption doctrine to justify Iraq, and so whatever your private thoughts are about whether preemption is now going to be necessary in 2% of the cases or 6% of the cases once every 10 years or once every 20 years, it's not something you really need to have a big debate on. I mean, in a weird way, they're hurt by their honesty. They thought post 9/11 we're in a new world, a world of terrorism, a world of technological, the spread of weapons, potential spread of weapons of mass destruction. The need for preemption as a supplement to deterrence and containment and all the other means of foreign policy is going to be greater. And that's all the doctrine says. I mean, it's been wildly mischaracterized as if preemption is replacing deterrence. The document explicitly says we will continue to deter and contain, as we are this very day, deterring and containing countries all over the world. That's why we have troops in Japan and Korea and Europe and, in Bosnia and Kosovo. But you will occasionally have to preempt, and you will perhaps more occasionally have to preempt in a world of terror and state-sponsoring terror and dictators, unfortunately, seeking to develop weapons of mass destruction. But I half agree with you that it's been a little bit of a red herring in the debate, and you don't need the whole doctrine of preemption to justify this particular action.
Give these guys a break. Give them a break. There they are, a White House trying to win a vote in Congress, messing themselves up at the UN, trying to take care of all these Europeans. And somebody comes up and says, we've got a policy paper to get out this week. And the timing couldn't have been worse. But I believe, at least that's how it would have happened in administrations that I worked with. I don't put much emphasis, I think it was a bad timing, and I think that Bill Kristol's exactly right. Preemption has always been a right of a country, a sovereign country, and one like the United States. And I just think that this was a bungling, bureaucratic White House like I'm so familiar with. So I just say this is not it's not a major change in policy that I see, and it's basically a red herring.
Deutsch gives him a pass. We're going to this gentleman here, please.
Thank you. My name is Bill McCamley. I'm a second-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School. I'm from Las Cruces, New Mexico. My question regards something you brought up, Mr. Deutsch, the question of Israel. Let's say that that Saddam Hussein has a Scud tucked away somewhere in the mountains with a chemical warhead on it, and he gets it off and it lands in Tel Aviv, and the missile defenses that we've put in there do not work. In 1991, or 1990-91, we made a huge effort to keep Israel out of this war because of the instability in the region. It doesn't seem like that kind of effort is being made now, and at the same time, Ariel Sharon is not what I would call a moderate leader. If Saddam Hussein does get off a weapon like this and Sharon attacks, the possibility of a regional war is very, very real. Are we ready for that, both militarily and as a society? Thank you.
If Saddam Hussein uses a chemical warhead on a city in Israel, given their long history, I believe that the chance of a response is very, very probable, although again, I don't know that. And I don't think it matters whether it's Sharon or any other Israeli leader. I think the likelihood is very high. Here again, that possibility is not an absolute barrier to action, but it is a warning of taking the most careful action, making sure you have use of Jordanian air bases, which will help you intercept Scuds if you can find them, which we're certainly in a better position to do now than we were in 1991. It is again a mark, which I tried to stress in my comments, be careful and don't move here until you have made the probabilities as much in your favor as you can.
Just two very quick comments. I was in the White House in 90 and 91 and slightly involved in the discussions with the Israeli government. There was never an agreement from Israel, of course, if weapons of mass destruction, if chemical weapons had landed in Israel, there was not an agreement not to respond. They didn't respond to the 39 conventionally armed Scuds that had landed in Israel. So I don't think any Israeli government could not respond if weapons of mass destruction were used against their cities. I think this time it's very much of an open question. If he lobs a couple of Scuds that land in Haifa Bay and harm no one, I think Israel can stay out. They would have a very tough time staying out, obviously, if substantial numbers of Israelis are killed. I mean, Sharon is a belligerent fellow in some ways, but if you want to see a really right-wing and hard-to-deal-with Israeli government, you should meet the late Yitzhak Shamir. You know, it's not as if in the 1991 war there was a Perez-led government leading Israel. I don't believe it'll lead to a regional war. Everyone just keeps saying this. It's just not true. Let's say it uses a chemical weapon, God forbid, and lots of people are killed in Israel or killed in the West Bank, for that matter. It wouldn't just be Israelis who would be killed, presumably Palestinians would be killed, and Israel responds. It's not going to lead to a regional war. Is Egypt going to cross the border with Israel if Israel responds? Is Syria going to cross the border? I don't think so. Is Saudi Arabia suddenly going to decide to fight a war with Israel? I mean, it's something devoutly to be wished doesn't happen, and we are spending a fair amount of time trying to ensure that it doesn't happen, and we're going to go into Western Iraq and try to suppress the Scuds at the beginning of the war, and we're going to try to persuade Sharon to restrain his government if nothing really bad happens. Having said all that, if it were to happen, it's not as if people always say this, Israel would respond, and then there'd be a regional war. Well, why exactly would that be?
Okay, this gentleman, please.
My name is Herman Sood, and I'm coming from the medical school in the MGH. I would like to follow on this last question, but first I would like to introduce the question by saying we are regularly told that many Muslims have an intense hatred for the United States, but our government, and it has not been mentioned here at all, has provided no serious explanation for the basis of that hatred, or whether or not that hatred is directed against United States government policies or United States government citizens, United States citizens. I personally would wager that it's against United States government policies, particularly those in the Middle East. And if it is the United States government policy, I've heard not one pip of a discussion from the United States government as to why these people have a hatred so intense that they're prepared to commit suicide. And there have been plenty of people, Mr. Crystal, who are not total dummies, who are convinced that we run a worthwhile risk of more than one government changing, maybe Pakistan to Taliban type, with real nuclear weapons and missiles to deliver them. But if there are people who are that intense hatred, it seems to me that we ought to have some discussion as to why these people have such an antipathy towards our governmental policy. And the question I would like to ask, before going off on this war, which I do not approve of, but apparently we're going to do it, would it not be to our advantage to have a declaration by the United States government that after we have conquered and owned Iraq, that we will not allow United States petroleum companies to control all of the Iraqi oil industry, from prospecting to drilling to refining, selling, and shipping?
I think we got it.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Crystal.
I hope Iraq
It's a good question, but I'm trying to keep as many opportunities for people to put questions, so short answers are appreciated. Please.
Look, I hope Iraq becomes a huge exporter of oil. It's good for the citizens of Iraq, and I have no position on whether it should be American companies, French companies, or Iraqi companies that export that oil. I think... No, it's not a problem. One reason we are disliked in the Middle East, and I think this is a very difficult problem to deal with in truth, is we have supported dictatorial regimes in that region. We thought it was in our national interest to do so. Bernard Lewis has commented that the people in the regimes which we dislike the most, the people like us the most. The Iranian people seem to like us an awful lot because they would like to be liberated from a regime which in turn hates us. The people in Saudi Arabia and other countries where we seem to be propping up, Egypt perhaps a dictatorial regime that is not serving the interests of the people, understandably resent that U.S. role, and I think Saudi Arabia in particular is a huge question mark for the future of U.S. Middle East policy, and I myself disagree with the Bush administration. Well, it's not with all recent administrations' Saudi policy. It's easy for me to say that. Actually making a transition to trying to foster a different sort of regime in Saudi Arabia is a very big challenge of the next decade, I would say.
So I have a different point, sir. You know, you characterize Muslims, and it seems to me that that is wrong on many, many levels. There is an Islamic world out there that stretches from, you know, Tunisia to Indonesia. You've got every different possible variety of people with different views, different political attitudes, certainly different views towards the United States and the United States government. And I think that it is really careless to look at this as being a Muslim versus U.S. problem. I do think it argues, because of our the complexity of that world and our great interests in it from Indonesia to Tunisia, that we act carefully and make sure that by one dramatic action, we don't create an inability to pursue our interests elsewhere in the world. But I don't think it is proper or helpful to say that Muslims hate the U.S. government or the United. It's a very complicated situation with thousands and thousands of different problems. And I certainly can tell you that there are many countries, Islamic countries, which have been helped by the U.S. For a long time.
This gentleman, please.
Hi, my name is Jason Samin. I'm a junior at the college. I'm wondering if we're fighting a war on terror or a war on dictators that may or may not have nuclear weapons. Because although I know Saddam Hussein supports terror, it was Osama bin Laden who orchestrated the September 11th attacks. And when bin Laden was looking for people that hated the United States enough so that they were willing to fly planes into our buildings, the rhetoric that he used was playing on the fact that people hated the fact that United States troops had a presence in Saudi Arabia. And by going into Iraq, I don't see how we won't be opening up an opportunity for bin Laden to use that same rhetoric, or whoever else would choose to use that rhetoric. And I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
I think we're fighting both wars, actually, and they're related wars, but they are different wars. But look, the President was clear about this in the State of the Union speech. There's a war on terror, and there's a war on dictators who are developing weapons of mass destruction. The second is not a new war. Obviously, in the case of both Iraq and North Korea, you've had great concerns in previous administrations about what was going on there. One is made more dangerous by the rise of the other. I think that is a true statement. Look, bin Laden did his recruitment of these people at a time when we were deeply involved in a peace process in the Middle East, when we were not invading Iraq, when we had backed off from a confrontation with Iraq, in fact, when there were no inspectors in Iraq. I don't think there's just any evidence, frankly, that, you know, being nicer to Saddam Hussein persuades anyone, any appreciable number of people in the Arab street to like or dislike the U.S. more or less.
Please, in the balcony.
My name is Walker Stanovsky, and I'm a freshman in the college. I came actually not expecting to ask any questions tonight, but Dr. Crystal, you said that in our present situation, the United States should be liked if possible, but also feared by other countries. And then you said that, you mentioned at a different point that Saddam Hussein had used terror as an instrument of statecraft by way of justifying military action against Iraq. And I'd like to know how you distinguish between being feared as a nation and using terror as an instrument of statecraft.
Well, I would distinguish. I'd like to be feared by dictators and potential aggressors, and I don't think the U.S. uses terror as an instrument of statecraft. We don't exactly go around the world randomly invading countries or using weapons of mass destruction. Well, we don't. I mean, that's very funny, but ask the people in Bosnia or Kosovo if they welcomed our intervention or not. My critique of American foreign policy, and I'll say a word about this since preemption came up, and I feel like we left that a little bit undone. If you asked me to criticize American foreign policy for the last 15 years, I'd say we probably have been too reluctant to intervene at times when we could have saved thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of lives. Rwanda being an example there, and I'm not making a partisan point, because God knows the Republicans in Congress were no more interested, were less interested probably in intervening than the Clinton administration. But I think the American force has mostly been a force for good in the world, and it certainly is a check on terror, on dictators, and on those who would use terror against their own citizens and against people abroad.
Okay, thank you.
Please, this balcony.
Good evening. Thank you for talking to us tonight. Well, I have a very brief question, and I think in a sense it addresses a lot of the issues of precedents and motives that were asked in previous questions. The question will be, after Saddam Hussein, who's next? Who do you think will be the next head of state that will justify going to war?
Good.
I guess that's funny. Speaking for the war party, look, the president has said, I think correctly, that the combination of Saddam, of an aggressive dictator who's determined to develop these weapons, has used these weapons, has invaded neighbors, has broken agreements with us and the international community, that is actually unique. And he's been perfectly clear that, for example, North Korea, horrible, horrible regimes, really responsible for hundreds of thousands, probably millions of deaths of its own citizens, also developing weapons of mass destruction, it would be great to have regime change there. I think we should push for that as much as we can, but I think that is a little more of a traditional deter, contain, and use diplomatic and other efforts type situation. So I don't think the Bush administration is going to go around after removing Saddam looking for other wars to start. I do think they think that doing this would establish the principle that you can't flout all these agreements with impunity, and they think that a democratic and united Iraq, admittedly not an easy thing to bring about, but not an impossible thing, I think, in the Middle East would have a very good impact on the single region of the world that right now probably is the source of greatest instability within itself, instability for other regions, the instability is exported to other regions, think of Afghanistan or Pakistan even, where there's been, in a sense, a Saudi export of a particularly radical form of Islam and therefore of instability to a different part of the world. And it would be very good for the citizens of that region. There's no reason why every nation in that region has to be a dictatorship except Israel and to some degree Jordan.
I would go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Excuse me, sir. Please.
It's outrageous. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah.
I really want to hear the question from her again. Let's hear what the question is.
I'm sorry?
I'd like to hear the question again.
Yes, the question was, after Saddam Hussein, who's next? I mean, who are the people who should worry now?
Who's the next target? After
I'm sorry if it's a little bit...
Which other countries? You mean,
Yes.
I see that. Who's next in Iraq? Thank you very much.
Who's next?
Right. I mean, I was...
You're not even going to Iraq.
No. I thought the question had to do with if there is another person who follows it. Let's say some lieutenant general, corps commander knocks him off. How do you know then that you have enough stability there to work with that? I mean, let's say the good news. Let's say that you're lucky, and all of this turmoil leads a corps commander there to knock him off. What does it take to make sure that we can engage with that person to have the kind of growth in the country towards democracy that we all hope and seek. And I think that needs to be given thought to also, because that Corps commander will pick up the phone and say, I need the following. And we have to be prepared, regardless of authorization and appropriations problems in the Congress, to respond in a way if we think that there's a suitable hope there. So it's a very important question about Iraq, and I'm sorry I misunderstood the direction in which it went. That was why I asked to hear it again. Thank you.
We're just about to the end here, but this gentleman is going to get the last question.
Thank you.
Brief, yes.
I'm Joe Goodstein, and I'm a junior in the college. I have one question, which is that not that foreign policy should be made with so much reference to democratic sentiment, but to an extent it seems that the Bush administration is using the war on terror and the support that the American people are willing to afford the administration automatically now because of the attacks on September 11th in order to justify going into Iraq. And while I happen to support going into Iraq now with Mr. Crystal, I'm wondering whether or not the actual fact of the matter is that there's a link and that the threat is increased from these dictatorships because of the war on terror or because of terrorism, or if we're actually facing what is nothing more than a very good excuse.
I mean, I'm in a funny position answering this for this reason. The Weekly Standard cover on December 1st, 1997, which was when the inspection regime started to fall apart, was Saddam must go. And we made the case for regime change and for military action, if need be, to secure that then. And the president himself, President Clinton, did in February of '98. And then, as I say, there was a deal which got papered over, and everyone moved on. So for me, the case for regime change, for intervention, once the inspection regime collapsed and the sanctions started to collapse in Iraq, has always been there. On the other hand, I don't think it's simply an excuse. I mean, it's fair for the president to say 9/11 changed a lot. And the relative urgency of doing it changes in a post-9/11 world from a pre-9/11 world. I don't think that's exploitation of 9/11 or of the war on terror. It's a reasonable judgment. It'd be kind of crazy to say this huge thing happened and it didn't affect our thinking about foreign policy at all. And I think that's really all that's happened. And to be fair to the administration, they went to Congress for a fresh authorization. This is now a year later. I mean, they didn't take advantage of what would have been in two or three months a really whipped up state of public opinion. It's not as if there's automatic support for the Bush administration on all things now. And again, I don't really know how to answer because, you know, if he waited another year, would he then be free of the charge that he wasn't using the war on terror? This war on terror is going on for quite a long time, and I think they've done a decent, you know, responsible job of trying to lay out the case for Iraq on its own merits.
So there's no question that Saddam Hussein is involved in terrorism. I remind you in '93 when Secretary Aspen was Secretary of Defense, Saddam Hussein tried an assassination attempt on former President Bush. So there's no question about that. But they're, generally speaking, I believe they're two separate problems. And the real issue here is possession of weapons of mass destruction.
Well, I told the audience at the beginning that the question was, should the U.S. attack Iraq now, that is, in the next few months, assuming the path to a crossroads at which you have to decide to do it or not to do it? Bill Kristol has given a very powerful argument affirmatively, and John Deutsch has given an equally powerful argument against, but for the audience here, you're going to get a chance to vote. Okay? So if at the end of this road, in 6 weeks or 7 weeks, the president were to be interested in your view, and you're going to offer the view, pull the trigger on an attack, then, that is in the next couple of months, or don't, okay? Only two choices. How many would pull the trigger? Raise your hand. Most people would try to weasel out, but if you have to vote, okay? And how many would vote no? Okay. Right. Now, I'm not going to ask you whether anyone's opinion was changed by the discussion tonight, but I am going to give our speakers an opportunity to see whether they've changed their mind or would like to say anything in the last in a minute, please.
well, I'll let John go last, but his dramatic admission or confession of a change of mind would be an appropriate note on which to close. I would like to, I'm very heartened by this show of hands. I was an undergraduate here 30 years ago, and I would say it would have been, what was that, 3 to 1, maybe 4 to 1? It would have been more like 30 or 40 to 1, I would say. And furthermore, a recently former CIA director would not have been allowed to speak at Harvard. I mean, I mean that literally when I was an undergraduate, and in that respect, I think it's a tribute to the Kennedy School and to Harvard that we've had this civil and I hope somewhat enlightening discussion.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here and participate in these discussions, and it's especially a pleasure to talk with a gentleman like Bill Kristol, so I thank you all very much. Thank you.
Let me announce that for students who are interested in continuing this debate in the Institute of Politics conference room, there's opportunities for continuing discussing that didn't get to be done here, but we thank folks very much. Great. Good. How are you?
I got a little round of sprayers that out of time, and I forgot to use my punchline. That was John Doe's, and I carefully, I carefully nexus to testimony. I was like,
thank you for saying very simple discussion. Should we attack him now or later? That was a very simple discussion. Should we attack him now or later?
My version of the kind of
That's exactly what that is.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Good.
Well done. I would like.
Yes. No, well, I can't help but that's the range of opinion.
That's not a range.
No, it's a big range.
Tactics.
It is tactics, but it's a big range.
I think I said enough.
Well done, Graham. You did well. Pardon me, but I would like to Bush states repeatedly that he teaches to establish democracy as law. I would like to know when the fairly elected government of Germany generalized supports against the way that the Germany described
That I'm not like I would think it would be
very liberalized. It was very
And even the most